All right, welcome back. We are going to talk about a very intense rivalry that has cooled off as of late, but nonetheless is certainly worth studying in any sort of rivalry class. The Lady Vols from Tennessee versus the UConn Huskies. All right, so your author of this chapter in the Rivals book describes rivalry, the term itself, as a positional disparity that contributes to a sense of partisanship. Okay, let's think about that for a minute. We're very familiar with this term partisanship in this day and age in the media. Usually it's used to describe strong party loyalties toward either Republican or Democrat, and defining oneself as anti the other group, right? Would you say that that's pretty accurate in terms of partisanship? So not only are you in favor of your in-group values, but one of your in-group values is that you're not a specific out-group. That's partisanship, right? You don't want to give an inch to them, no matter, even if it doesn't matter, even if it doesn't affect you. You don't want them to have any kind of positive claim. So the first part of this quote talks about a positional disparity, right? Which means you're in conflict. There's some difference in your positions, all right? And we're going to come back to that in just a minute. You know, now we think about UConn as being at the top of the women's basketball world, but there was a long period of time, not too long ago, when Tennessee occupied that position, and the Lady Vols under the leadership of Pat Summitt. And the positional disparity was Tennessee at the top and everyone else at the bottom, right? So we'll come back to that. Also, another quote, sport media commercial complex has to promote it. Wow, that sounds complicated. Sport media commercial complex. What does the author mean there? Well, let's break that term down a little bit. She's talking about the sports media, right? So you've got the media covering sport, and then the commercial complex, right? So what pays the bills for sports media? It's the advertisers, right? And the sponsors of games. And so her argument is that for a rivalry to really take hold, the media has to get behind it, and for the media to get behind it, there have to be advertisers and sponsors interested in it, right? And if advertisers, what are advertisers and sponsors interested in? Attention, right? They want to get eyeballs for their brand. So she's making the case that this rivalry in women's basketball has really superseded all of the other sort of rivalries in women's sports, because it has been able to overcome some pretty big obstacles to that other women's sports have faced and continue to face. We'll talk about those in just a minute. So what's the method that the author uses here? I think that's also important, an important learning point about this chapter. It's described as a media content analysis, right? And what does that mean? It means that she's solely going to secondary sources to build up evidence and the narrative and the chapter, the description of this rivalry. So she's going to newspaper articles, she's going to archived video footage, magazine articles, maybe books that have been written about the rivalry. She's looking at any sort of media content, meaning she's not going directly to the sources, right? She's not going to people that worked at Tennessee or people that worked at UConn or Gino Auriemma or Pat Summitt themselves to talk to them. She's looking at media content, and she's analyzing that content to see how did the coverage of this rivalry change over time. And that's a pretty well accepted methodology for investigating something like rivalry. And she comes to some interesting conclusions. But first she sets the stage with the foundation, talking about the challenges of women's sports teams, of women's sports in general, and getting any kind of media attention. And then she points out the fact that in women's sports, a lot of times it's the individual sports that will get the limited attention that's given to women's sports, and team sports get even much less attention. She uses the example of ESPN and only 10% of sports coverage on SportsCenter being devoted to women's sports, and over half of that going to individual sports. So that leaves less than 5% of coverage for any sort of women's team sports on SportsCenter. But yet she then points out that in 2004, when these two teams met for the national championship, it set the record to that time for the highest ratings of any college basketball game to that point on ESPN, meaning that more than any of the other men's games that had ever been broadcast on ESPN, that's how high the ratings were. The ratings were higher for this national championship game between UConn and Tennessee in 2014. All right, let's move on. So there's really three components that she in the chapter emphasizes, and they fit pretty well with some of the elements of rivalry that we've talked about. Relative dominance, okay? Now there's two ways that this term can be used. On the one hand, it can be used to describe rivalries that are somewhat unbalanced, meaning that one team has been very dominant over the other team. And so those rivalries tend to be unidirectional, meaning that the team that's getting beat might see it as a rival, but the team that's always beating them doesn't necessarily feel the same way. That was the case for a long portion of the Yankees-Red Sox rivalry, where the Yankees were just dominating the Red Sox. However, that's not the way that we mean the term here. This term relative dominance can also be used to describe a situation where you have two teams that are so much better than everybody else that they just dominate them, which leads to an increased feeling of rivalry between those two teams that are so much better than everybody else. We're going to come back to that use of the term when we talk about Ohio State, Michigan, as it relates to the Big Ten as a conference. In this case, you have two teams that are not in the same conference, but they're so dominant over everybody else in all of women's college basketball that it contributes quite a bit to their ongoing rivalry. In fact, you have this period of 22 years where either UConn or Tennessee wins 13 of the national championships, right? That's only leaving 9 for every other program in women's college basketball. That's how dominant these two programs were over everybody else. The second component that's emphasized quite a bit is essentially what we would refer to as star power. Actually, let me start our list here now. I'm going to put relative dominance on the list over others, just to clarify. And then you have star power. In this case, the star power is really the coaches. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been incredible superstar players that played for both of these coaches. That is true. But the coaches had been with the programs for so long that they became the face of the programs, and they really defined what the programs were all about. They also got the bulk of the media coverage, and remember, this is a media content analysis is how this analysis was developed, was by analyzing media content. And you could see the years that each one of these coaches started with their programs. Pat Summitt in the mid-'70s, and then Gino Emma in the mid-'80s started with UConn. Think about for a second where UConn was at that time, if you know anything about the history of college basketball, not just women's, but also men's. UConn was one of the original founders of the Big East, which started about that same time. And that was started because the profile for basketball, these basketball programs that didn't have dominant football programs, were all on the East Coast, wasn't that high at the time. And ESPN comes along, early 80s, ESPN's founded, or late 70s, and they're searching for content, and it becomes a national cable channel in the early 80s, and ESPN is based in the Northeast, right, in Connecticut, actually not that far from UConn's campus. And so it's perfect for them to feature these basketball programs that aren't getting sort of the coverage that maybe they had deserved up to that point. And so they formulate the Big East, they sign a deal with ESPN, and ESPN essentially treats UConn pretty much as its home team because they, again, are so physically close to each other. UConn's headquarters being in Bristol, ESPN's headquarters being in Bristol, UConn's headquarters, UConn's campus being in Storrs, Connecticut. So you've got the star power of these two coaches. They're competing for recruits, right? The point of me telling you the Big East story is that UConn was, before Gino got there, UConn wasn't really a prominent national program at all. You know, they had just started the Big East. It was getting a little bit of coverage, mostly on the men's side. And Gino comes and he's like, I'm going to raise the profile of this program to become a national program. Well, Pat Summitt was already there with Tennessee. She had already been at Tennessee for over 10 years, and she had built Tennessee into a powerhouse. Gino's strategy for bringing up the UConn program is to basically attack the Tennessee program and just keep knocking on their door until they would finally agree to play UConn in a non-conference series. We'll talk more on that later. Gino is brash, right? He's not afraid to call out UConn in the media, to use the media to his advantage to try and raise the profile of his program. Because remember, they're getting hardly any media coverage. So he's like, I'll be controversial. It's hard enough to get media coverage on women's basketball when you're trying to be all nice, right? He's like, forget that. I'm gonna provide quotes for reporters to write about. And the person to call out at that time was Tennessee. So once he builds the program to where he can recruit on a national level, of course they start competing for recruits, but they certainly have conflicting styles and personalities, right? I talked about Gino being brash. Pat Summitt is very polite. She's very professional in the way that she operated. And she's not one to sort of mix the pot, not in the media. She might in practice, right? She's very intense, just like Gino, but she's very polite and she has that southern charm, having grown up in Tennessee, that we might associate with that part of the country. The media, this rivalry is happening at a time that there's excitement around women's basketball in general. UConn and Tennessee are certainly a big part of that excitement, but so is the Olympics, the 96 Olympics in Atlanta, the formation of the WNBA coming right out of those Olympics. Many of the stars in the 96 Olympic team were from UConn and Tennessee. Over half the team was from UConn and Tennessee. And these are the players that then became the superstars to try and get the WNBA off the ground in the 90s. So their first meeting comes in 1995. So it takes Gino about 10 years to get UConn up to the prominence of Tennessee, or at least to the point where Tennessee would play UConn. What happens though is once they start meeting, the games are so popular that ESPN and CBS, each of which had broadcasted early meetings, they both want games, right? And so UConn and Tennessee do something that's pretty unprecedented for non-conference teams. They agree to play each other twice, a home and home in the same season, each year. And so almost like you would play a conference team. That's typically what conference teams do, is play home and homes in the same season, but not typically non-conference teams. But there's so much hype around this game that after the first few years of only meeting once during the season, they decided to contract for 2 games annually, and that started in the 99-2000 season. So they met 22 times in 13 years after 2000, and UConn won 13 of the 22 in those 13 years, which left 9 wins for Tennessee. So point being, UConn did get the best of them, but not by a huge amount, right? Tennessee was still winning quite a bit of the games. They met 7 Of those 22 times that they met, 15 were regular season meetings, 7 were in the tournament, including 4 times for the national championship, meaning that each team advanced all the way through the bracket to play each other 4 times in the national championship. UConn won all 4 of those meetings. So UConn was, once they got them to play, once they got Tennessee to play them, they really held up their end of the bargain and actually beat Tennessee quite a bit. However, before the 2007-8 season, so we're talking about quite a while ago, this rivalry was called off by Pat Summitt. She felt like Gino had been committing, in his program, been committing recruiting violations for several years. She was not satisfied at all with the NCAA's investigations, feeling that the NCAA was letting him off light because he was such a superstar for women's basketball and he had created a program that was very popular in the media. And so she finally said, I've had enough. We're not going to play you anymore if you're going to continue to essentially engage in this type of recruiting, what she saw as recruiting violations. Specifically, one that really sparked her to call off the series was the recruiting of Maya Moore. And apparently what happened was UConn arranged for her, while she was visiting campus, to also visit the ESPN headquarters, which is a violation because you can't take recruits on an official visit off campus. And the headquarters, of course, are off campus in a different town nearby. So you have these opposites that I had described earlier. This certainly contributes to the rivalry. I talked about Auriemma as being very brash. The author describes him as the cranky Yankee and her as the Southern lady. But you also have them being very similar in many ways. Very intense, very passionate, very competitive. They can both be abrasive. So even though we might think about Pat Summitt as being a Southern lady and very polite, she's not afraid to mix it up, and she's willing to be abrasive, very dedicated, and very much perfectionist. So you have both opposites in a lot of ways, but also similarities, kind of like we talked about with the Bird Magic situation, right? Part of the reason that Auriemma was so abrasive and blatantly brash, I guess you could say, was that he was an immigrant. He immigrated to the U.S., or his family immigrated to the U.S. from Italy when he was age 7. They had very little money. They immigrated to New York, and so he's from the East Coast. He grows up in that environment, very much an immigrant tale, meaning that he had to fight for everything. His family had to fight for what they could get, right? I'm sure they endured some discrimination as immigrants during that time. So it really toughened him up. That's very much a part of his tale, because that's what he ended up doing for the UConn program, was fighting for the program, to build the program and get them to prominence. He was the newcomer, right? UConn was the newcomer on the scene. Tennessee was sort of the grand old guard, led by the grand dame, as she was described in the chapter. This polite Southern lady, very professional in everything that she did, but also very dedicated and intense to what she did. So why are these two teams rivals? Well, we've got relative dominance and star power on our list already. Certainly we can add frequency of play to that list, given that they played twice a year for quite a while. However, I'm going to also put a line through this because they don't play anymore in the regular season, or very infrequently. So not as much as they used to, which is why you've seen this rivalry start to die off. So this is more of a historic rivalry, certainly one we're studying in a class like this because of the context and how famous it was and how it raised the profile of the entire sport because of the rivalry. Also, we can put defining moments. With so many tournament appearances, clashes in the tournament, but also meeting for the national championship 4 times in a short span. you're going to get some defining moments there. Also some defining moments off the court with the recruiting allegations. Let's put cultural difference on this list. Without a doubt, you've got lots of cultural difference between the individuals and the leaders of the program and also the programs themselves, right? And I think I've belabored that point enough, so I won't go into it any further. I think you can put relative parity on here. Yes, UConn did get the best of them, meaning UConn won more times than they lost against Tennessee during the height of this rivalry, but Tennessee won their share as well, right? I think it was 9 out of the 22 meetings during the height of the period. Tennessee won and was successful there. We don't have geography in this instance, right? We don't really have a clash of geography. We don't really have much similarity between the two programs other than their success. Trying to think if we are missing any other ones. There's none that come to my mind immediately, so we will wrap up here.